What if the story we tell about time is less a straight line and more a tide, advancing, retreating, leaving unexpected objects on the shore? Every civilization inherits a timeline. We learn it early, almost by instinct. Stone gives way to bronze, bronze to iron, fire to steam, steam to electricity. It is comforting in its order. Progress becomes a staircase, and history a careful ascent. But every so often something appears that does not fit the steps. An object where it should not be. A skill before its supposed birth. A trace that refuses to stay in its assigned era. This story begins not with answers, but with that discomfort. Imagine a quiet hillside or a forgotten mine, or a shipwreck slowly surrendering its contents to the sea. In each place, someone pauses. They look closer. And what they see unsettles them, not because it is dramatic, but because it is ordinary in the wrong time. A tool shaped with confidence, a mechanism assembled with intent, a mark left by hands that should not yet exist, at least according to the story we have agreed upon. History, after all, is not just a record of what happened. It is a consensus. It is built from fragments that survive and interpretations that endure. Most of what once existed has vanished. Wood turned to soil, metal to dust, memory to myth. What remains is precious but incomplete. And so the timeline we inherit is less a photograph than a sketch, revised again and again as new lines are added or erased. For generations, scholars have done careful work within that sketch. They compare layers of earth, patterns of wear, traces of chemistry and form. They argue, revise, and refine. This process is slow, cautious, and deeply human. It depends not only on evidence, but on trust. Trust in methods, in peers, in the frameworks that give meaning to discovery. Yet occasionally a finding arrives that strains those frameworks, not enough to shatter them outright, but enough to cause a pause, a raised eyebrow, a quiet debate that rarely escapes academic rooms. Sometimes the object is set aside, labeled an anomaly. Sometimes it disappears into storage. Sometimes it is remembered only in footnotes, or not at all. This is not a story about secret cabals or hidden masters of knowledge. It is something more subtle and perhaps more familiar. It is about the tension between certainty and curiosity, between the need for coherent narratives and the unruly nature of reality. Institutions, like individuals, are shaped by what they have already invested in believing. Across the world, scattered through time and geography, there are artifacts that seem to arrive too early. Not miracles, not proof of lost golden ages, but questions made solid. They ask whether invention always moves forward, or whether it sometimes loops back on itself. They suggest that knowledge can appear, fade, and reappear under new names. That human ingenuity may not belong exclusively to the recent past. To consider these objects seriously does not require abandoning science or reason. On the contrary, it demands more of both. It asks us to hold two ideas at once, that our current understanding is powerful, and that it is unfinished. That humility is not weakness, but a tool as essential as measurement. As we move through this journey, we will encounter objects that feel out of place in time. We will explore the environments that preserved them, the people who found them, and the debates they quietly sparked. We will not rush to declare them revolutionary truths or dismiss them as errors. Instead, we will sit with them, listening to what they reveal about how we know what we know. Because in the end, this is not only a story about artifacts, it is a story about memory, about how civilizations remember themselves and what happens when the past refuses to remain silent. And perhaps the most important question is not whether these objects change history, but whether we are willing to let history remain open to change. It started with a hammer encased in stone. Texas, 1936. A hiker and his wife wandered along the banks of Red Creek near London, Texas, when they spotted something strange embedded in a chunk of rock. It was partly eroded, revealing a wooden handle and a corroded metal head. They cracked the nodule open. Inside was what looked unmistakably like a hammer, ordinary in form, extraordinary in context. The rock surrounding it resembled Lower Cretaceous limestone, dated by geologists to over 100 million years old. But how could a human-made hammer be found inside such ancient material? The implications felt absurd. A tool of iron and wood, clear, familiar, modern, trapped in stone laid down before birds had fully taken to the skies. Some dismissed it instantly as a hoax or odd geological accident. Perhaps the concretion had formed around a dropped tool in recent centuries, mimicking ancient stone through mineralization. Others weren't so quick to explain it away. The hammer's construction was curious. Its head composed of nearly pure iron with traces of chlorine and sulfur, unusual even by modern standards. The handle was partially petrified, caught in the first steps of transformation from organic to mineral. To the mainstream scientific community, the case never gathered serious traction. No formal excavation, no clear stratigraphic context. Without those anchors, it remained a curiosity rather than a crisis. A mystery confined to the margins, yet the image endured. A hammer, simple and silent, locked in stone that predates humanity. It touched a nerve, not because it proved anything definitively, but because it disrupted the neatness of time. It challenged the privilege we give to linearity, the assumption that what is old cannot hold what is new. There's a kind of poetry in it. The hammer, symbol of creation, of labor, of will, buried in the earth's deep past. It evokes not a conspiracy, but a forgotten gesture. Someone, somewhere, lifted it once, struck something with it, and then it was lost or left behind, and time did what it always does. It covered. Whether the London hammer is an impossible artifact or simply an unusual one matters less than what it represents. It reminds us that the boundary between artifact and anomaly is not fixed, but negotiated. It invites us to reflect on the quiet ways that the past holds secrets, secrets that do not shout, but whisper, that do not rewrite textbooks, but ask them to listen more closely. The hammer in stone is not alone. It is part of a constellation of finds, each small, often forgotten, sometimes mocked, that suggest a more tangled history of tool and time. They are not revelations, but provocations. So we begin with this: a hammer held by stone, a question shaped like a tool, and the first fracture in the wall of certainty. Because what if time does not always behave the way we expect? What if now and then it folds, briefly, silently, and in those folds something passes through? In a dimly lit vault beneath Moscow, an artifact rests in quiet defiance of time. The Antikythera mechanism's lesser-known cousin, the so-called Russian gear, a small, bronze-like object unearthed in the 1990s near the town of Kamensk-Shakhtinsky. It was found embedded in a chunk of coal, reportedly sourced from a mine whose strata dated back hundreds of millions of years. And within that black stone, a finely threaded, gear-like structure, seemingly metallic, suspiciously symmetrical. A spiral of regular notches wrapped around a central axis. Machined? Coincidence? Or contamination? Skeptics quickly argued the object must have been introduced recently, perhaps a bit of mining equipment that fell into the coal supply chain. But there were those who insisted it had been found deep within the lignite itself, before any chance of contamination. X-ray analysis and metallurgical tests yielded more questions than answers. Some called it a fossilized machine part. Others dismissed it as a natural crystal formation. Still, its image, this cold spiral nested in primordial rock, gripped the imagination. Not because it proved the existence of ancient machines, but because it hinted again at complexity appearing out of sequence. This was not the first time gears intruded upon the quiet of deep time. The Antikythera mechanism, salvaged from a 2,000-year-old shipwreck off the Greek coast, remains the most celebrated example of unexpected sophistication. It was a mechanical computer with interlocking gears that could predict celestial events. Nothing else like it would appear for another 1,000 years. And so the pattern emerges, glimpses of precision in eras where chaos should reign. The Russian gear was never fully studied. It disappeared into a quiet corner of history, part lost, part ignored. But its story lingers, not because it was definitive, but because it was unclaimed. In a world hungry for neat timelines, it offered only ambiguity. What do we make of things that feel mechanical, deliberate, yet arrive too soon? Maybe it's not the object itself, but the discomfort it creates. A world ordered by logic and sequence doesn't welcome strangers, especially not those that carry the scent of industry into epochs long before humans walked the earth. In this way, the Russian gear becomes more than a curiosity. It becomes a test of openness, of method, of humility. It asks whether we are willing to consider that invention is not always a straight line, that the urge to measure, to build, to synchronize may be older than we think, not necessarily human, not necessarily from civilizations lost, but perhaps from minds, curious minds, unknown to us. What if intelligence is not a peak reached once, but a pulse, emerging, receding, and re-emerging in forms we have not yet imagined? A whisper in the stone. That's how the legend of the Dorchester pot began. In 1851, near Dorchester, Massachusetts, workers were blasting rock for construction. The explosion tore through layers of solid pudding stone, an ancient conglomerate, and out of the debris came something wholly unexpected, a bell-shaped metal vessel split cleanly in two. It was small, about 4.5 inches high, with a narrow neck and a flared base. Silver-colored, finely crafted, and adorned with intricate floral inlays. A design that seemed more at home in a museum than in the middle of ancient rock. The Boston Transcript reported the find, noting the surrounding stone was estimated to be hundreds of millions of years old. But how could a manufactured object, refined, ornamental, exist in stone formed long before the rise of mammals, let alone humans? Immediately, voices rose in protest. The pot must have fallen into a fissure, they said, or become embedded in the softer matrix of the stone through some unknown process. Perhaps it was a Victorian candle holder or a piece of East Indian brassware, mistaken in context. These were plausible theories. Sensible, safe. And yet no one could quite explain the clean break, the way the two halves lay among freshly shattered stone, or how such a delicate item could survive such violence. The pot faded from view, relegated to the margins, its physical form lost, its story drifting into the realm of rumor and curiosity. But like the hammer in Texas and the gear in coal, it belonged to a category that resisted full dismissal. There is a quiet category of human history. Things found, then doubted, displayed, then discarded. They are the edge cases, the ones that refuse to either confirm or disappear. And in their stubborn ambiguity, they reveal the discomfort we have with not knowing. The Dorchester pot, whether artifact or accident, remains a symbol of that discomfort. Its delicate engravings echo not just through stone, but through the mind, a suggestion that craftsmanship might have appeared before our timeline allowed it. And in that possibility lies something tender, not revolutionary, not radical, just humbling. What if the first instincts to decorate, to beautify, to shape the world into more than utility? What if they happened again and again across forgotten rises and falls? What if the human urge to create has deeper roots than we dare imagine? Not every mystery must end in revelation. Some serve better as reminders that the past is not finished speaking, that beauty too can be buried, and that silence in stone may carry echoes we've yet to understand. The desert does not easily give up its secrets. but sometimes the wind uncovers what the earth had long hidden. In 1938, deep in the Bayan Kara Ula Mountains, along the border of China and Tibet, a team of Chinese archaeologists made a strange discovery inside a cave system. Alongside ancient burial sites and shallow graves were hundreds of circular stone discs, each about a foot wide, with a hole in the center and spiral grooves etched from edge to core. They would come to be known as the Dropa stones. The grooves were unlike any known markings. Microscopic analysis revealed they were not merely decorative, but appeared to carry a kind of script, a dense spiral language unknown to any scholar. Over time, interpretations emerged, most controversial of all being that the grooves told the story of beings who came from the stars, crash-landed in the mountains, and lived among the locals. Official institutions dismissed the story. The language was undecipherable. The cave's remains were culturally ambiguous. The tale was speculative, unsupported, fringe. Some claimed the stones were later hoaxes. Others insisted they were misidentified ancient musical instruments or burial tokens. But the stones were real, documented, studied, then quietly forgotten. It's easy to lose things in silence, especially those that fall outside consensus. The Dropa stones occupy a peculiar liminal space, not quite artifact, not quite myth. Their design doesn't match known ancient tools or ceremonial objects. Their grooves don't resemble any natural erosion. They linger, unresolved. And so we return to the question of story, who gets to tell it, and when it is deemed credible. The Dropa stones are not proof of visitors from beyond, nor are they necessarily evidence of advanced forgotten cultures. But they are a kind of echo, of a people who carved stone in spirals for reasons we no longer understand, of a place where sky and mountain met in ritual, in memory, in mystery. What if language itself has died many deaths? What if not all writing was meant to be read, but to be remembered? These discs, circular and silent, might have been calendars, songs, maps, warnings, or just expressions of meaning too distant now to name. The point is not to decode them completely. It is to feel their presence, to wonder how many times we have buried knowledge simply because it no longer speaks our tongue. The Dropa stones sit on the edge of knowing, a spiral inward, not toward certainty, but toward humility, toward the idea that meaning too can erode, leaving behind only questions in stone. Beneath layers of hardened ash and time, the city of Baghdad once held a secret bright enough to spark questions that have yet to dim. In the 1930s, while excavating near the village of Kujut Rabu, just outside Baghdad, workers unearthed a small clay jar. Inside was a copper cylinder, and within that, a corroded iron rod. The pieces were unassuming, modest, yet when assembled, they resembled something astonishingly modern, a galvanic cell, a battery. Today it's known simply as the Baghdad Battery. The discovery was puzzling. The jar dated to the Parthian period, around 200 BCE, an age known for its art and architecture but not electricity. No documentation, no clear purpose. Yet the components, iron, copper, and acidic residue, could, if combined correctly, generate a weak electric charge. Speculation bloomed. Was it used for electroplating? For ritual? For medicine? Or was it never a battery at all, just coincidental assembly mistaken by modern eyes hungry for pattern? Mainstream archaeology offered caution. No other examples confirmed its use as a power source. No wires, no devices, no legacy of electrical understanding. It stood alone, intriguing but unsupported. Still, the image persisted, a spark from the past, flickering where it shouldn't. A glint of light from an era still considered dark. The Baghdad Battery became a symbol of possibility, of the idea that knowledge need not be linear, that invention can emerge unrecorded in silence, that someone, somewhere, may have experimented with forces they could not name, simply by intuition or need. The beauty of the battery lies not in its certainty, but in its potential. It asks us to imagine a craftsman 2,000 years ago, testing materials, noticing reactions, perhaps even harnessing them for purposes now lost. A flicker in the workshop, a reaction on the skin, a glow that vanished with time. What if genius doesn't always lead to revolution? What if discovery happens quietly, then fades, leaving only remnants behind? The Baghdad Battery doesn't demand that we redraw timelines. It asks us to soften them, to allow for aberrations, for forgotten minds, for silent sparks that never caught fire. And in that small, silent jar still lies the wonder, not of electricity, but of curiosity, waiting in the dark. High in the Bolivian Andes, where the wind cuts like stone and the sun carves shadows into the mountains, lies one of the most enigmatic places on earth, Puma, Punku. Scattered across the Altiplano near the ancient city of Tiwanaku are massive blocks of diorite and andesite, stones harder than steel, cut with a precision that seems to defy their age. Clean right angles, interlocking grooves, drill-like holes. Stones that fit together like puzzle pieces, though many now lie broken, tossed by time or quake. Archaeologists agree the site dates to around 500 to 1000 CE. But the techniques used to shape these monoliths? That's where the mystery begins. There are no records, no tools found nearby that can explain such intricacy. Traditional interpretations suggest stone hammers and years of effort. Others believe there must have been lost techniques, perhaps involving heat or vibration. And then there are the fringe voices, calling it the work of lost civilizations or visitors from afar. But what if the truth is more human than that? Imagine a people so intimately tied to their environment that they developed methods we simply no longer recognize. Techniques passed through gesture, not script. Knowledge lost not to cataclysm, but to time and disuse. Entire tool sets that left no trace because they were not made to last, only to create. Puma Punku doesn't offer us definitive answers. It offers us a rupture, a moment where what we see doesn't match what we expect. The stones are not magic, they are not impossible, but they are out of sync. They hum with a different logic. What makes this site so haunting is not just the precision, but the feeling that we are glimpsing the tail end of something already fading. A peak of engineering and artistry on the brink of disappearance. The ruins are less a monument than a memory, one we don't fully share. What if we are not the pinnacle, but part of a cycle? What if moments of brilliance rise and fall like tides, each wave wiping the shore clean before the next arrives? Puma Punku may not rewrite history, but it dares us to look again, to see not just what is missing, but what might have once been known and now is merely stone lying silent beneath the sky. In the frozen cradle of Siberia, where the cold preserves what time would otherwise erase, a discovery surfaced that stirred the edges of known history. The Shigir Idol. Recovered in 1894 from a peat bog near the Ural Mountains, the Shigir Idol is a towering wooden statue, over 11 feet tall, carved with geometric patterns, humanoid faces, and cryptic symbols. For decades it was admired as a curiosity, its meaning elusive, its age assumed to be ancient but not extraordinary. Then came the shock. Radiocarbon dating in the 1990s, and again with greater precision in the 2010s, revealed that the idol was not merely old, it was over 12,000 years old. Older than the pyramids, older than Göbekli Tepe, carved in the immediate aftermath of the last ice age, when much of the world was still wild and unformed. This was supposed to be a time of survival, not symbolism. A time when humans were still nomadic, their art limited to cave walls and hand tools. Yet here stood a monument, complex, abstract, intentional. How had a culture with no cities, no metal, and no agriculture created something so evocative? And more importantly, why? The patterns on the Shigir Idol are not random. They repeat, vary, and suggest some kind of language or code, though no one has cracked it. Some believe it's a map, others a cosmology. Some see it as a record of myths long lost. It challenges the assumption that symbolism arose only after settlement, that complexity required cities, hierarchy, and surplus. The idol says otherwise. It says that long before we farmed the land, we carved meaning from wood, that the need to explain the world may have preceded the tools to control it. Perhaps it's not the mystery of the idol that matters most, but what it reveals about its makers, a people who looked at the chaos of nature and chose to respond with art. What if the urge to understand, through symbol, shape, and story, is not a result of civilization, but its seed? The Shigir Idol survived because it sank, sheathed in anaerobic mud that shielded it from decay. It outlived its carvers, their descendants, their languages. It rose from the mire like memory itself, buried, weathered, but intact. We may never know exactly what it meant, but we know it meant something. And perhaps that's the deeper message, that the human need for meaning is older than our tools, older than our temples, older even than our names. It began with a footprint, in stone. In 1968, near Antelope Springs, Utah, amateur fossil hunter William Meister cracked open a slab of Cambrian shale. What he found startled him: the fossil impression of a trilobite crushed beneath what looked uncannily like a human shoe print, a heel, a sole, even a faint suggestion of tread. But the rock? Over 500 million years old. The trilobite was real, unmistakable, an ancient marine arthropod, long extinct. But the shape that encased it? That was the enigma. Mainstream scientists quickly dismissed the claim. The footprint was a natural formation, they said, an artifact of erosion and coincidence. Rock under pressure breaks in patterns that can deceive the eye. The brain sees familiar forms even in randomness. Pareidolia, not paradox. And yet the image lingered. A shoe, a step, a creature crushed underfoot before feet had even evolved. It was absurd, impossible, but also strangely poetic. Because the Meister print, whether real or misread, touches on something primal, our desire to see ourselves in deep time. To imagine, even briefly, that the human story might extend beyond the boundaries we've drawn for it. What if we are not the first to walk? What if time is not a ladder but a labyrinth where paths cross and vanish only to be rediscovered? The Cambrian rock does not lie. It holds its creatures in silence, as it has for 500 million years. Whether the shape is shoe or stone, it reminds us how little we understand about the vastness of the past. We speak confidently of timelines, of epochs and transitions. But those charts we memorize are models, not certainties. They are built from fragments, stitched into coherence by consensus. Useful, yes, but vulnerable to the unknown. And perhaps that is what the Meister print ultimately offers. Not proof, but perspective. It asks us to walk more humbly through time, to accept that we are visitors here, not masters, that for every answer we uncover, 1,000 questions remain entombed in rock. Not everything mysterious is meaningful, but neither is every dismissal definitive. Sometimes a mark in stone is just that. Sometimes it is something more. And the space between those possibilities is where wonder lives. In the heart of India's temple-rich region, beneath layers of devotional stone and sacred geometry, lies a sculpture that continues to baffle engineers as much as it inspires pilgrims. At the Meenakshi temple in Madurai, a stone carving known as the model of a gear rests quietly among the ornate architecture. It is not central to the temple's theology. It does not draw crowds. But to those who pause, it appears anachronistic. The object resembles a modern bevel gear, complete with evenly spaced teeth and an angled surface. Machined symmetry in a place shaped by hand tools, chisels, and centuries of stone tradition. The temple itself dates to between the 12th and 17th century CE, though much of it may be built atop older ruins. Skeptics argue the gear shape is ornamental, symbolic, or simply a coincidence. After all, spiral and radial patterns are common in temple design. But to engineers and machinists who have visited, the resemblance is too precise to ignore. It suggests a familiarity with rotational mechanics long before industrialization made such shapes commonplace. Could artisans have intuitively carved what we now recognize as a mechanical form, or did they inherit the image from an older tradition, one that grasped rotation, torque, and function in ways we've forgotten? The gear does not stand alone. Across ancient Indian temples, carvings appear that resemble modern tools, aerospace forms, and even chemical structures. Most are artistic flourishes, perhaps metaphors. But a few linger in that uneasy space between imagination and insight. There is power in this ambiguity. The Minakshi gear challenges not our science, but our assumptions. It suggests that form and function may not always evolve in a straight line, that symbols can precede systems, that what we now engineer, others may have once intuited. And beyond that, beyond the possibility of ancient mechanics, there lies a deeper invitation to respect the intelligence of those who came before. Too often we assume that modernity owns complexity, that before engines and steel, humanity lived only in shadows. But look at the temple, its astronomical alignments, its acoustic chambers, its layered symmetries. These are not accidents. They are echoes of knowledge shaped differently, expressed through stone, story, and sacred rhythm. What if progress is not a climb, but a dance, advancing, receding, circling, returning? The stone gear may not turn, but it moves something nonetheless. In the mind, in the memory of civilization, in the way we imagine what once was possible. And in the stillness of the temple's dark corridors, where incense coils like time itself, the question waits: how much have we truly invented? And how much have we merely remembered? Beneath the rolling hills of South Africa, inside the walls of an old gold mine near Ottosdal, miners struck something unexpected. Perfectly spherical stones, smooth, grooved, and strangely balanced. They were unlike anything naturally occurring in the mine's strata, which dated back over 2 billion years. Known now as the Klerksdorp spheres, these objects range in size from a few centimeters to palm-sized. Some are metallic, composed of a hard nickel-steel alloy. Others are made of pyrophyllite, a relatively soft sedimentary rock. But the grooves, parallel and precise, are what ignited debate. How could such symmetry arise in deep time, long before multicellular life, let alone intelligent toolmakers? Geologists insist the spheres are natural, concretions formed under extreme pressure and unique mineral conditions. Similar formations exist elsewhere, shaped by slow geochemical processes. The grooves, they argue, result from the rotation of the spheres within the surrounding rock over eons, pressed by tectonic movement. Yet not all the spheres fit this explanation. Some appear perfectly balanced along a single axis. Others contain fibrous or sponge-like internal structures that resist easy categorization. A few seem to hum faintly under specific frequencies, a claim more anecdotal than proven, but persistent nonetheless. To believers in ancient knowledge, the spheres became evidence of a civilization lost before history began. To skeptics, they are a testament to the Earth's ability to mimic design without intention. But perhaps both views miss the point. The Klerksdorp spheres remind us that nature is not bound by our imagination. It can sculpt elegance out of randomness. It can produce forms that appear engineered, not by accident, but by slow, deliberate chaos. The Earth, too, is a creator. Still, the human mind reaches for meaning. When we see a sphere with carved lines and metallic sheen, we instinctively assign purpose. We picture tools, toys, relics. We resist the idea that beauty can be unintentional. What if the spheres are a mirror, not a message? They show us how thin the line is between artifact and anomaly, how the mind fills gaps, adds stories, seeks familiar logic in unfamiliar places. The spheres do not need to be machines or messages to be meaningful. Their mystery lies in how we respond to them, in our desire to connect dots across vast, silent distances of time. They may not be evidence of the past we've forgotten, but they are evidence of our hunger to remember, and perhaps that is their greatest function, to awaken wonder and remind us that the world still holds shapes we cannot fully explain. In the jungles of Colombia, long before the age of powered flight, goldsmiths crafted amulets with wings. They're small, only a few inches across. Found in burial sites of the Quimaya civilization, these artifacts are known collectively as the Quimaya airplanes. Their wings sweep back like jet fighters, tails are vertical stabilizers, and fuselages taper with aerodynamic elegance. They bear a striking resemblance to modern aircraft or even delta-wing drones. Dated to around 1000 CE, these golden figures were likely worn as pendants or ritual offerings. For decades, they were simply labeled as zoomorphic, stylized animals, perhaps birds or flying fish. But the more closely one looks, the less natural they appear. Unlike birds, the wings are rigid and horizontal. The tail fins are triangular and upright, not functional for an animal, but standard for stabilizing aircraft. There are no feathers, no limbs, just smooth, symmetrical geometry, engineered by intuition or memory. In the late 20th century, engineers scaled up one of the designs, adding a rudder and propulsion. To the surprise of many, the model flew. It glided smoothly, balanced, functional. The experiment fueled the mystery. Were these truly aircraft in miniature? Were the Quimbaya artisans echoing something they had seen, or merely imagining shapes that happened to resemble flight? Archaeologists caution against overinterpretation. Artistic license, they argue, often leads to abstraction. Cultures have long fused features of multiple creatures into symbolic forms. To see jets in gold is to see ourselves, but perhaps that's the point. What if these shapes emerged not from observation, but from an archetype, something deeply embedded in human imagination? The dream of flight is older than Da Vinci, older than myth. It's carved into our bones, our legends, our skyward gaze. The Quimbaya pieces may not depict ancient aircraft, but they show that 1,000 years ago someone shaped metal with vision and balance, capturing motion in stillness. A symbol maybe, a toy maybe, but undeniably precise, and in that precision lies the wonder. Whether or not they flew, these artifacts challenge our assumptions about inspiration, about what ancient minds could perceive or project, about the blurry line between art and engineering. What if flight was not first imagined in Europe, but in the jungles, gold glinting like wings above sacred graves? The Quimbaya figures remind us that the desire to rise, to transcend the ground, the known, the now, is as old as civilization itself. And that in the hands of artists, sometimes imagination builds the future in miniature, long before it arrives. In the shadows beneath the ocean, buried in coral and silence, a city sleeps. Off the coast of Yonaguni, Japan's westernmost island, divers in 1986 stumbled upon a submerged structure that seemed to defy nature's casual hand. Massive stone terraces, sweeping staircases, broad platforms, and sharply angled walls, all carved, it appeared, from the bedrock itself. The Yonaguni Monument, as it came to be known, rose from the sea floor like a forgotten ziggurat. Geologists quickly entered the fray. Some argued the formation was entirely natural, formed by tectonic shearing and erosion. The region is rich with sedimentary rock that fractures in straight lines. Others, particularly marine archaeologists, saw signs of human intervention. Tool marks, post holes, even what looked like a ceremonial gate. If the monument is man-made, its age presents a puzzle. Sea levels were last that low over 10,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age. That would place its construction in a time when mainstream history suggests only hunter-gatherer societies roamed these islands. Could an advanced culture have flourished and fallen here, leaving no written trace, only stone? Critics argue that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and in this case the evidence is ambiguous. There are no artifacts, no inscriptions, no signs of sustained human presence. The site exists in a geological gray zone, a place where nature and intent seem to blur. And yet the formation is mesmerizing, monumental. If it is a natural sculpture, it is one that mimics design with haunting fidelity. Yonaguni draws us into deeper waters, where the line between environment and civilization dissolves, where the earth itself seems capable of dreaming in symmetry. Or perhaps where human history lies drowned, waiting to be remembered. Not all cities rise. Some vanish beneath waves, beneath wars, beneath centuries of forgetting. The ocean holds secrets not easily excavated. And the Yonaguni Monument reminds us that land was once sea, and sea was once home. That the past is not fixed in place. It shifts with tides, with tectonics, with time. What if we are only beginning to understand how much has been lost? Whether Yonaguni is an ancient city or an accidental temple of stone, its impact lies in what it awakens in us. A sense of humility, of awe, of deep time perspective. The recognition that the story of civilization may have chapters drowned beyond recovery. And beneath that recognition, another, quieter truth, that absence does not mean emptiness. Sometimes what remains is not the ruin, but the question it leaves behind. In the end, we return to where we began, with a question, not an answer. Across deserts and oceans, jungles and stone, we've followed whispers of what might have been. A hammer in ancient rock, a sculpture older than the written word, gears, symbols, carvings, and cities that do not sit comfortably on the maps we've drawn. Each artifact, real or rumored, invites us not to rewrite history recklessly, but to listen more carefully, to acknowledge that what we know is vast but not complete, that every era is filled with silence as well as stories, and that the past is not a museum of certainties but a living mystery, unfinished, fragile, and waiting. The idea of impossible artifacts challenges more than chronology. It challenges identity. Who are we if the march of progress is not linear, if intelligence is not confined to a single arc of development, but a pattern that flickers, rising, vanishing, and returning? Maybe some of these anomalies were misread. Maybe others were misplaced. Maybe a few were truly something else. But together, they offer a deeper insight. That wonder is part of being human. We have always asked questions bigger than our tools could answer. We have always shaped meaning from mystery. Whether building with stone or staring at stars, our ancestors were not primitive. They were people, dreamers, problem solvers, makers, like us. And perhaps, like us, they too lost things. Wars, floods, shifts in climate, and power. The forgetting of names, the crumbling of knowledge not because it failed, but because it was no longer needed or no longer understood. So we close this journey not with finality, but with a kind of reverence. Reverence for the hands that carved when there was nothing but stone, for the minds that imagined flight before wing, for the spark of curiosity that persists across millennia. The story of these objects, whether proven or possible, is less about facts than about attention, about being willing to look again, to hold history loosely enough to let it breathe. Because maybe the greatest discovery is not a lost city or forgotten technology. Maybe it's this, that time is not a wall, but a window, and through it we sometimes catch a glimpse, not of what was impossible, but of what was profoundly human. That, in the end, is the question we leave you with. What else lies just beneath the surface of what we think we know, waiting not to be explained, but to be seen?